within the Holy Roman Empire, and the movement begins out of that. So there's this tremendous power structure. Remember, I told you 10% of you would be with the church. There would be the Lord of Salt Creek, the Duke of Salt Creek, and they have the nobility has complete power of life and death over you. If they say, I want your boys for the army, you have no choice. So, piety, power structure. What else? Plague. So the bubonic plague hits Europe. 1/3 of the population dies. Think about death, the prevalence of death. Everyone in this room would know someone who died in that 4-year time. And for many of you, it would be a lot of your own people. So death is just everywhere. And then there's one other event in the 1400s that changes Europe. What is it? Printing press. So those are the 4 P's, and you should remember those as we go forward. Now, I just want to circle back because this is where it begins. 1525, January 1525 in Zurich, Switzerland. This is from the mural, and this is that first baptism. And remember, I've argued, and I will argue and keep arguing, because when you read the primary sources, the people who were there, both the people who were baptized and the people who write about them, they understand that this is a revolution that is not just a religious revolution. Yeah, it's religious. These people are beginning to say, we want to look at some of their theology. These people are beginning to say, well, they say that the ultimate Christian is one who follows Jesus. Not the one who's perfect, not the one who is a super Christian and goes to a monastery, not the trained theologian who preaches in churches, but the average person who makes a decision to follow Jesus. And when that person makes a decision to follow Jesus, no forfeit, to follow after. They used it repeatedly. But it's also political. This is a political revolution because in this time period, everything is bounded by the nobility. So Salt Creek Township would belong to Murph and Dawn. She would actually be Lady Salt Creek. And it would belong to them. And if they were Catholic, everybody in that township is Catholic. If they choose to go with Luther and the Protestant movement, everybody in the township is Protestant. And so there would be times when entire townships would switch religious affiliation in a treaty, or when the Lord changed. Well, people don't change that quickly. Remember, they're normal people. And so the Anabaptists, these Beetle-type, begin to say, the Church of Jesus is not bound by political boundaries. And so they're dangerous because they're suggesting treason. Actually, they're put to death. They're primarily put to death not for their religious beliefs, but for their ideas about how the kingdom of Christ is bigger than the political entity. Michael Sattler, for instance, was martyred for his faith in 1527. He is put to death for treason against the government, because he said, I'm not going to fight the Turks. Now understand, in that world there is Muslim fundamentalists. Al-Qaeda of that world are called the Turks. They're pushing up from the southeast. In a minute we can see a map. They're pushing up from the southeast, and they get all the way to the gates of Vienna. And they are they're the infidels. And all of Europe is scared of them. And Michael Sattler says, I won't fight them. I will not fight them. And here's his argument. He says, and these are, by the way, the Germans and Austrians and Swiss are absolutely weird about keeping track of things. So there are verbatim court proceedings that you can still read from that time period. And Michael Sattler has 9 counts against him. The primary one is treason. And in his trial, they ask him, is it true that you say that if you were to fight, you would rather fight on the side of the Turks than on the side of the Christians? Now, understand, that's a mouthful. That would be like us saying, if we were to fight, I would rather fight on the side of Al-Qaeda than on the side of Christian America. And Michael Sattler says, it is so. Because if I were to fight, I would rather fight on the side of the Turks, because they are Turks of the flesh. But you, he points to the jury and the judges, are Turks of the heart. You're just as bad as them, but you clothe it in Christianity. And so their argument is that Christianity, the true church of Jesus, surpasses all political boundaries. Missionizing in this time period by the Catholics and the Protestants is simply done at the point of the spear of sword. You conquer a land, everybody becomes Christian. And these people begin to say, no, you share the gospel and the love of God, the love of Christ. They literally would talk about sharing the love of Christ with other people. And when you do that, that's when they become Christians. So they would have argued that it is entirely feasible for somebody in the township of Salt Creek to be a Christian, where he is Protestant, and St. Peter's Basilica, St. Peter's Church in Norrisburg, the Catholic Church, that's Hardy Township. Hardy Township would be Catholic. He said it is entirely possible for there to be followers of Jesus in Hardy Township and in Salt Creek Township. Because it's not about political affiliation. It's also a social revolution. And so the social revolution has its part in so many pieces. One is women. Women suddenly had rights. In the Catholic Church, women could go to convents, be nuns. When the Protestants took over Europe, they shut down the convents, and suddenly you had all these women who had been in convents and didn't have anything, they didn't have any practical skills. And so many of them joined, after studying, many of them were learned as well, could read, and joined the Anabaptist. So, and Anabaptism gave a space to women. The other thing it does, it says it doesn't matter if you're the Duke of Saltcreek or the poorest peasant. When you kneel down at the cross, there's an equality there. And when you partake of communion, you're saying the blood and body of Christ, and you give and receive to your brother and sister. There is something that happens there that levels the playing field. And suddenly the rich are no longer rich, the poor are no longer poor. They're believers together in Christ. And therefore, the rich should give to the poor. Because they're your brother and sister, they're your family. And some of them espouse a near communism kind, but communitarian at least. Later, they're called Hutterites. So I want to just give you these core ideas, because you understand. So you understand when we talk about a revolution, these people, I mean, literally, they're the most hated people in all of Europe. The Anabaptists. And when I look back at that, I often thought of them as fussy old people sitting around discussing theology and what to wear. They didn't. They went out and lived love into their communities in such a way that got them killed. And they said, we will rather give our life than take life. So they would have argued that the essence of Christianity is to follow Jesus in radical trust and discipleship. Jesus is our king. Zwingli is the leader of the land, and Luther is the preacher in the church, but Jesus is our king. We have no Caesar but Jesus. And we follow him alone. This is worked out in missions. In 5 years after Anabaptism began, they had what is now called the Martyrs' Synod, where 60 people gathered, divided out Western Europe to take the gospel into all of Western Europe. This kind of gospel. 5 years later, only 2 of those people are still alive. So you follow Jesus in radical trust. And then the brotherhood, the Christian community, is bound to share that discipleship in giving and receiving with each other. So, as a body, this is very practical. As a body of prophets, the gathered body of believers are the ones who make decisions together about how to live in the current world. And we hold each other accountable to those decisions. And so if somebody needs admonition, it's the body's responsibility to give that admonition. If somebody needs physical help or food or anything else, it is the body's responsibility to care for them in that way. So, think very carefully about what the implications this has, even for us today. The Christian community is bound to give and receive with each other. And then discipleship is expressed to the world around us through love and peace. They said, what? We can't fight. We couldn't fight if we wanted to. Because that's a soul. So think about, this is expressed in very early in the movement. The first one is about your relationship with God. The second one is about your relationship with your brothers and sisters in the body of Christianity. And the third one is about your relationship to the people outside of Christianity. And suddenly you have this kind of fully orbed way to think about it. And word spreads rapidly. I mean, it really spreads. This is a map of the northern parts of the Holy Roman Empire. Let me just point out a couple things. Here is Zurich, Switzerland. So this, from here down, is Italy. So you go down into the boot of Italy. This Amsterdam is Holland, up the top left. And so from Holland down into about the northern part of Italy, and west into what is now the Czech Republic. Nicholsburg is in the Czech Republic. And it spread. This is in the first 10 years of Anabaptism, you begin to see pockets of Anabaptism in all these places. And it's particularly strong here, along the Rhine. This is the Rhine that flows north to Amsterdam. And it grows very rapidly in Amsterdam and Holland. And here it is a country movement, a movement of country people. In Amsterdam, it is an urban movement. And it grows very rapidly in those places. Now, it grows west. Well, also, when you think about, and in the north, in Holland, in Amsterdam, particularly, it had a bit of an apocalyptic flavor. If you're being persecuted for your faith, it's easy to think the world is ending. And you make provisions. And it has this kind of sense of, we have got to prepare to bring all the world into the kingdom of Jesus. They really took seriously the responsibility that Jesus left with them at the end of Matthew. So two books that you find two books from the Bible that are often used by the early Anabaptists are Matthew and Acts. And Matthew, and they're one of the most earliest translated into German language of the people. What is at the end of Matthew? The Great Commission. And they saw that as the key point. We take the gospel into all the world. And then they saw Acts as the model of how to do it. So they will often tie those two together and use those two. And it spread. I mean, this is 10 years after Anabaptism. In Switzerland, where it first began, I think I told you this, but Ulrich Zwingli said, dealing with the Catholics is child's play as compared to dealing with these dreaded Anabaptists. They're taking over our world. What a legacy. But 10 years after the movement, in 1535, the spread essentially stops. And there's a reason for that. So, in the early 1530s, it spread into Amsterdam, and it developed. Hans Hut took it north, and then Hans and Woodman, you don't need to remember, they're preachers. And they're traveling preachers who take the gospel, but particularly Hut and the Woodman were very charismatic and preached a lot about end times and the millennium coming. Well, actually, they believed that the millennium of Jesus was already on earth through the church, the true church of Christ. By the way, Hut kept very careful track of how many people he baptized. In 6 years' time, he baptized 10,004 people. That's amazing. One man. So, it spreads. And a group of them flee Amsterdam and flee to the North German city of Munster and settle there. Munster is in kind of a gray area. It is ruled, any city who has a cathedral in it is like a queen city, they would call it. So Munster has a cathedral. It's ruled by a kind of quasi-Catholic bishop, but the Protestants are strong in the city. So the city's in turmoil, and these Anabaptists move in there. And in the early 1530s, Bernard of Roodman moves there. And he's a charismatic preacher. And very quickly, several of the men are elected to the Munster City Council. And suddenly you have influence. And by early 1534, The Munster City Council is majority Anabaptist. And this sounds beautiful, doesn't it? Suddenly they're peace. In mid-1534, Rothman brings a charismatic young political leader in place, and his name is Jan van Leyden. And Jan van Leyden is quite charismatic, and he's able to bring the city together. By now, the city council is in full support of Leyden. And they declare the city of Munster the Anabaptist Kingdom of Munster. And suddenly, Anabaptists from all over Europe flock to Munster. This is a picture of modern-day Munster. It's a fairly large city. It's actually a fairly large city then. This is at their Hunter, they have a large Hunter balloon out there. But this is Munster. In the middle, you can kind of see the outline. Let me see if I can move my mouse up there. You can kind of see the outline of the walled city. Here's the old city. Can you see that? That's the old part of the city right there. Right in the middle. And at this point, this is the cathedral, by the way. This is St. Lambert's Cathedral in Munster. This is a picture I took. Eureka and I and the Hummels were there in 2017. I stood at the market square and looked up towards the cathedral. So that's how it looks today. At the time, in 1535, it's a mid-sized city. There's about 15,000 people living in the city. It's under the rule of a Catholic prince bishop. And the guilds, they're like trade unions. You have the Leather Workers Guild, and they protect the interests of the worker. And the guilds get locked into a struggle with the bishops. And the Anabaptist leaders, city council and so on, support the guilds. And so you have these kind of trade unions, and the more conservative, or the strong Catholic bishop. And like I said, by early 1534, the Catholic bishop has no more impact in the city. Well, the Catholic bishop has to do something. He's a prince bishop, so he's a nobility bishop. So he has to do something about this. So he musters a force of an army and lays siege. They quickly close the city, walled city, quickly close it in, and he lays siege to the city. Now think about this. You suddenly have this new order of things in this city. At the heart of the city is St. Lambert. And these Anabaptists would gather here, and Rothman would preach these dynamic sermons about how the millennia has come to earth, the rule of Jesus Christ on earth has come, and we need to take it by force. We need to take a hold of it. And it is one of the few times that Catholics and Protestants agreed about something. They agreed that this cannot keep going. And so the Catholic bishop and Protestant forces, they have about 9,000 to 10,000 men who are laying siege to the city. By now, there's a problem, though, because not everybody in Munster is willing to be rebaptized. So if you're not willing to be rebaptized, what do you do with these people? So they literally, in the middle of a winter sleet storm, drive those who weren't willing to be rebaptized out of the city. At the point of the sword. Anabaptists did. Drove them out of the city. Kept all their possessions. And Jan van Leyden, this young, he's in his 20s, charismatic leader, says, hey, we need to create a new order in Munster. And he does. For instance, you can't lock your house door. It's always problematic because it's public. Everyone says public, so we should be able to come in your house anytime we want. But if you're hiding food there, by now the city is feeling the effects of the blockade. And it grows, and Jan van Leyden married this woman. They call her the Black Queen. And they'd ride regally through the city, have these large, sumptuous meals, and the people are starving. The other Anabaptists are starving. Now, it goes on, and in the Easter of 1535, it's now 1535, Jan van Leyden says, I can single-handedly beat the bishop's forces. So he Easter morning of 1535, he brings together his 12 disciples. Shouldn't that tell you something about someone if they have 12 disciples? Yeah. He and his 12 disciples ride out of the city with great fanfare on their horses, with their swords, and they're going to conquer the 9,000 men out there because God is on their side, and promptly get their heads cut off. But he had prepared, and Jan Matthias, a young baker, 24-year-old baker, took his place. And Matthias, immediately that day, marries the Black Queen, his widow, and 4 other women. And he institutes polygamy, but just for the leaders. If you have a beautiful wife, you're her husband, and the leader gets an eye on that woman, he'll have your head cut off for some perceived crime. Do you understand what's going on here? It's really going on. But in all this time, they're proclaiming the Anabaptist Kingdom of Munster. They also burned any book that they didn't approve of. I talked about the sexual deviancy, only for leaders, and terrific atrocities against minorities. Well, somebody gave the city away. And later in 1535, the bishop's forces, somebody opened the gate for them and came in. And they immediately captured the city. There was no choice, but they didn't have a chance. This is a terrible picture. It's from the mural. But they killed all the men in the city, except for the 3 leaders, put the 3 leaders on trial. Roitman, Jan Matthias, and another man, put them on trial, and then executed them, and put their bodies into cages, and hung them on the cathedral tower. St. Lambert's Cathedral hung the 3 cages with the bodies in them on the cathedral tower, as a warning to all of Europe against these dreaded Anabaptists. If a woman was willing to recant, they let her go, to let the children go, but most of them left with only what they could carry. It's a terrifically bad time. This is a picture from 2017 of St. Lambert's Cathedral with the 3 cages still hanging on it. Today, I happened to be there, and the caretaker or custodian came out of the cathedral, and I walked up to him, and I said, "Sprechen Sie English?" North German is a little more difficult, they're much more formal. He said, "Oh yeah, I speak good English." I said, "Can you tell me about those 3 cages hanging up on the cathedral spire?" He said, "Are you Amish or Mennonite?" I said, "I actually happen to be." He said, "But that's the only people who ask." But that's not the only people who ask. In 2013, Marita and I were at Yale University, and I was in this wonderful class taught by a good friend, someone who became a good friend of my mentor, Bruce Gordon's wife, Rona. She was Scottish. She had this wonderful brogue. She was a really good teacher. And she was doing transitional moments in Western Christianity. And I noticed that one of her lectures was on the Radical Reformation. And it's at 7:45 in the morning, and I love that time, and I thought, this is great. And that day, I actually sat up front. This is my day, she's going to talk about my people. And she begins, properly, talking about rebaptism. About 3 minutes in, she launches into Munster. And for the next 47 minutes of the lecture, she talks about Munster. At the end, she says, there were some other Anabaptists who didn't choose this route. But this is how most Europeans experienced Anabaptism. And I did not know, I kept shrinking down in my seat, sliding further down. After the lecture was over, I went to her office, knocked on the door, and she said, "Is that you, Marcus?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "I thought you might show up." I said, "That was so unfair. This felt so unfair." She said, "You need to read history. And you can't be afraid to look at in her words, the sordid, the bad pieces of your history. They actually teach you almost more about your history than just all the good all the time." She said, "In fact, I'd like you to write your final paper on this." And she gave me a lead. What time do we dismiss? 10 after. Okay. So I ended up writing a paper about this, but we're going to fast forward 175 years to the 1600s. This happens in 1535. 1600s, 1670s, so 150, 60 years later. The Pilgrims are in America. The Puritans are in New England. Boston is established. And Boston is settled by Puritans. They're not Anabaptists. They're influenced some by Anabaptists in England. They're English who come to America. And they settle in New England, and they talk about building a fence to keep all the other religions out, all the other forms of religion. They particularly hate Quakers. Because Quakers settled Pennsylvania. They particularly hate Quakers because Quakers believe, like Anabaptists, that the church is not bound to a political entity. The Puritans didn't. They saw New England as the New England where the sanctity and the freedom of God's word would be able to go through out over the land. Two Quakers preach their way north from Pennsylvania and are caught by the Puritans. And they're put on trial. And they're hung to their death in Boston in the 1670s. And John Northrop is the senior minister in the Boston Puritan Church. He preaches at the church where Paul Revere later hung his lanterns in. And he writes a 54-page treatise, tract they call them, arguing that they had to hang the Quakers. They had to hang them. Because if they didn't, New England would become like Europe was under the dread of Anabaptist. And he ties it all back to Munster. So what does that have to do with us today? By the way, that kind of movement is not dead in our circles. Think about the similarities between a man from Berkholtz, Ohio, Carroll County, who went around cutting people's beards off, sexually deviant, book burner, controlled everything, Sam Mullet. You think, when I began to read these stories of Munster, there's a couple of good books. I thought of Sam Mullet. I thought about other parts of our movement where you give sole power to a very few. And when we do that, because of our belief system, that we believe that the authority of God is found in the gathered body of believers like us here, rather than a single person. And that the church is not bound to any political entity or political party or political movement. It's bigger than that. When we move away from that and put power in the hands of a few, we often end up with this. And it effectively stops the spread of Anabaptism in Europe. Moves it into the deep countryside where people began to just hide. It gave rise to a different approach, this kind of quiet in the land, where we do everything we can to avoid any kind of a conflict. But it also caught the attention of a young Catholic priest named Menno Simons. Menno lived in Friesland, which is just north of Amsterdam, right up off the top of the map. Draw a triangle between Amsterdam and Munster. Up at the top, that's where Menno Simons was a Catholic priest. By the way, he was an alcoholic who once bragged that in the first 2 years of his priesthood, he never cracked open the Bible once. But then he began to think, and he began to read. And then he heard these stories. And he heard about Munster, and he decided to write about Munster, and wrote a treatise against Jan van Leyden. And when he did that, he examined their beliefs. And when he examined their core beliefs, he began to say, wait, there's something in Scripture about this. And this is 1535, for the next 30 years, he was rebaptized in 1536. And he, for the next 30 plus years, travels through the land and brings these small Anabaptist churches who have totally lost heart afterwards, brings them together and teaches them the true way of Christ. And Menno's motto was, this is the verse he would repeat more often than anyone else. For no one can lay a foundation other than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. And when you think about Menno ministering post-Munster, he's saying, you know what, we need to return to who we are, followers of Jesus Christ. There is no other foundation. Our practices or anything else is not a foundation that we can build on. We can only build on the person of Jesus Christ. For years, I thought of Menno as a fussy old man. I thought I would never enjoy visiting with him. There's a book about this big called The Writings of Menno Simons. And I had read it earlier when I was at a different place in life. And in the last couple of years, I reread it. And I engaged heartily with Menno, and I grew to really appreciate and enjoy this man. For instance, he's the guy who says, people accuse me of drinking wine when the common people drink beer. He said, if I get a chance to drink wine, I would. So common people, peasants drank beer. No one drank water because water was unsafe. It ate something fermented. The rich people drank wine. So the people are saying, you're eating, and he said, and eating roasted meat instead of cooked meat. And because rich people ate roasted meat, he said, if I get a chance to drink a glass of wine and eat roasted meat, I'm going to. But when I'm with you, I'm going to drink beer and eat seized meat. He's so much like the Apostle Paul in some of those approaches, that when I'm going to give the love of Christ to everyone I meet. And I won't always get it right. But it returns the Anabaptist Church to this. I think that this is one of the most valuable lessons that we can learn as Anabaptists today. That our belief system and structure is built on a person, not on a set of dress codes or theological statements. They're important. Those things are important, but they're second important. First importance is that if we believe that the essence of Christianity is to follow Jesus, and that Jesus works in our brothers and sisters to give and receive to each other, and that we share the love of Jesus to the broader world, and if we don't have that kind of foundation of Jesus, we'll end up where Jan Blyden and the One Strikes did. Some of the struggle that many of us have in our communities is that we've struggled with the petty dictatorships of religious programs. And they're no different than Jan Blyden. So it moves us. And by the way, I have gone back to Rhonda Gordon and said, you did the right thing at making that the key point of the lecture, if only for me. She did actually come back the next class period and say, one of the students reminded me that I didn't cover this very well. And so she spent another half class period talking about the good parts of the movement. So this is the tough parts of our movement, but it does something to our movement, and it spreads it into our people's lives and world. Thank you. Next week we'll kind of look at other pieces about spread, particularly east into Russia, and then west into the Americas. And then I think in 2 weeks we'll have a double session, February 10th. That's in 3 weeks. Yeah, 12. Sorry. We'll have a double session again where we'll see. We'll work with the Sunday school people about how to wrap it up. Thank you. Questions? See, you don't have to get up and go out now. You're all settled in, and we just go right on, right? Murph, you want to take a break? Yeah. Be back here.